Our final interview for the evening will be with Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper is a professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University. Excuse me. Formerly, he was a historian for the church history department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He is the editor-in-chief of the BYU Studies Quarterly and the managing historian over the Saints books. So right now we have Saints 1 and 2 out in the Gospel Library app. They're also in print. He is one of the people that helped to manage that. So, hi, Stephen.
Hey, Danielle, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm well too, thanks. Glad you can hear me.
Yeah, everything looks great. I can see you, I can hear you, no issues over here. So, welcome to our gathering. For those of you who are new to Uplift, Stephen actually came to our last gathering last year in person, and we have that online, we have that on YouTube. It's a really, really powerful discussion that he gave about some church history, about Joseph Smith, about William McClellan, I believe, as well. Or George McClellan. Yep. And it's really fantastic. So go ahead and look that up after our interview today. But for right now, we're going to get started with the same questions that we've been asking everyone for these interviews. The first one has to do with the fork in the road of your faith. Have you ever had an experience in your life where you felt like you were at a fork and one choice would lead you away from the restored gospel and the other choice would lead you toward the restored gospel? How did you navigate making that choice?
I've been thinking about this question. I don't recall a very dramatic instance like this. I can think of lots of little ones, right? I've told this story several times about when I was 14 and sitting at the breakfast table with my father, and the church news was there on the table from May 1985, mid-May, and it had in it an article about a Joseph Smith letter, and then it had the text of the letter itself. And in this letter, Joseph Smith explained to Josiah Stoll how to find the right kind of hazel branch and cut it just right and lay it down just right in order to find where the buried treasure was located. And that was just as strange as could be to me. And I asked my dad why they didn't teach me that at church. It was disruptive to my teenage faith. And I felt that, pretty, I don't want to overstate it, but it was a pretty big deal to me. And my dad did a really excellent job of validating my question and talking me through a way to deal with it, sharing his way of dealing with stuff like that. He didn't pretend to know stuff he didn't. He didn't ostracize me in any way. So a lot of the good things that Joe and others have been saying about how to treat someone, or President Eyring talked about years ago, talked about how to treat a student in a moment of doubt. My dad did all those things for me, and I think that might be why that never developed into too big of a crisis for me. Besides that, by the end of that year, that it was clear that the letter was a forgery. Mark Hoffman had killed 2 people and been caught. And so it was actually an instructive thing for me to realize that what I thought I knew was a tiny, tiny piece of a big, big puzzle. And my dad explained that to me. He said, look, I don't know the answers to these questions, but if you will cling on to the bit that you know and just keep looking and working at it, you'll see the way this all makes sense in the future in a bigger picture. And he was right about that. And so I've sort of put my trust in that all along. And therefore, anytime I come to that fork in the road, I have a tendency to remember that. There's a couple of Israeli psychologists who've done really path-breaking work in the last half century, and they've talked about biases that we have and how they influence decision-making. And one of the biases that is common to humans is one that they call "what you see is all there is." what you see is all there is. And so that's what I was like as a 14-year-old, and now as a middle-aged person. What I see is all there is. And that experience with my dad and then historical training have taught me to question that assumption very much, to interrogate it immediately, right? What is there that I'm not seeing? What is there that I'm assuming? What are all the possible pieces of the puzzle that I don't have yet? And that's helped me at those crossroads. I've never had a major one ever since. I think also that my life is very much shaped by my own version of the story in the Gospel of John, where the Savior feeds thousands miraculously. And they come back the next day on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, where he's crossed in the middle of the night. And they're looking for some more food. And instead, he gives them an absurd discourse. We tend to rationalize it by saying, well, he's talking about sacrament and so forth. But he tells them, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you have no part with me. He just intentionally gives them just absurd teachings. So much so that by the end of the day, just about everybody's left. They didn't get what they came for. They didn't get the easy spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down stuff. They got hard doctrine, hard sayings, it says in the Gospel of John. And Jesus puts a pointed question to the apostles, who are the only ones still around. He says, are you also going away? Are you going to leave too? And they respond, where else can we go? You've got the bread of eternal life. And so hard crossroads with the gospel for me, or with the church and its culture, have almost always turned me back to that response. Where else am I going to go? Right? The restored gospel is the one that promises me that I get to be with the people that I love most forever. It's the one that has the solution to the soteriological problem of Christianity. It's the one that has the best solution to the problem of suffering, in my opinion, the problem of evil. So where else am I going to go? There's not a better gospel. Mm-hmm. There's not a more beautiful gospel than the one we've got.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Ben, earlier in one of my earlier interviews with Ben Spackman, he talked about how people read often in faith crises enough history to challenge people, but not enough to be changed by the history or by the doctrine or by this or by that. And obviously it's a generalization, but in my own life, I relate to that, because when you first start reading things in summaries, and when you first start reading or hearing things in bits and pieces, it's very challenging. But the more time that I leaned into that experience, the more time that I searched and worked through things, not even just by reading apologetics or by reading books like books that you've written about the first vision and things like that, the more that I worked on myself as an individual, the more that I started to see the, in my opinion, absolute beauty and splendor of what the restored gospel is, and how incredibly powerful it can be for me in my life now, even 200 years after it first all started, like what it means for me now in my life with my problems today. And so I appreciate that testimony. I agree as well. Where else would I go having had that experience, such a fulfilling experience in a gospel and church like this? So thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you. That's really well said, Daniela.
Thank you. For the next question that we have, it kind of deals with relationships that we have with people of other faiths and those who have left the church. In your experience, what's one effective way to strengthen a relationship between people who have different faiths, whether when you have someone who leaves the church or maybe was never a part of the church and is agnostic or not religious or of a different faith? How can we work on those relationships?
I don't have any better answer than what I heard Joe saying. It was a beautiful one. And And the answer is love, right? It's charity. And it can't be fake, right? D&C 121 says unfeigned love. And so we have to love our brothers and sisters. And that can't be conditional on whether they believe all the same things I do or not, or act in the same ways.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And I think that that's a message we need to internalize as followers of Jesus Christ in general, that if we follow Jesus Christ, who is love, then we need to learn the ministry of love. And I think that that's really important. Now, we've already started to get some questions from our live feed for you. And the first one has to do with kind of the people that are the young youth that are coming up into church now and today. And it says, recently I have been having discussions with my friend, and he points out that there are a lot of people that know the gospel is true, but find the standards too difficult to live. For example, I think a really relevant issue today is things like LGBT young people who realize that the knowledge of the truthfulness of the gospel means that they need to live not just a chaste life, but a celibate life, or that they need to settle for something that they feel they can't settle for. How do we reconcile those things? How do we help people in situations like that?
I just would invite them to do the very best they can. Mm-hmm. If whoever it is, no matter what they've got to wrestle with, if they'll do the best they can and seek their own revelation from the Lord. Mm-hmm. What do they do in their situation? I'm very confident He'll guide them, lead them, love them, and help them through. I don't pretend to know how challenging that is, or 1,000 other things that people have got to somehow learn to cope with. And I have loved ones, of course, who have struggles of one kind or another. And I remember having a lunch with my nephew not long ago who's gay, and he had not come out to his family. And I just said to him, look, I don't know how out you want to be. I don't have any platitudes for you. I don't know the answers to the hard questions. I just want you to know that I love you, and I'm sealed to you, and I'm with you. I'll be, whatever that means, I'm going to be with you. So I would say that to the same youth. I believe that feeling I have is simply the gift that all of us have or hope to have of charity. In other words, I think it's a gift from God, right? It's a bit of a reflection of His love for His children. So I have it in a microscopic endowment, and He has it in an infinite amount. And so I think all that we're doing is reflecting that love. In other words, if they will do the best they can to love Him, they will always have His love with them. It's true that God loves us, and there's nothing we can do about that. We can't make Him stop loving us no matter what we do, but we can cut ourselves off from it. We can distance ourselves from it. D&C 95 says that. So if we will strive to love God and do the best we can, and I don't mean by behaving necessarily in certain ways, that might be part of it, but authentically loving God, He will always love us. And maybe that sounds simplistic, but I believe it's the answer to your question.
No, I think that it's a good answer too. Something that you said really stuck out to me about the ceiling. In my time researching church history as very amateur researcher, just reading and trying to understand what I can. One of the things that I have had the opportunity to study a lot of has to do with the temple. For a while, I studied the evolution of temple theology with existing records, and the ceiling when it was instigated was a really, really interesting thing for me at one point of my own personal doubts and struggles, especially because I started to find these quotes from leaders talking about what the sealing actually was. And for the longest time, I viewed the sealing as something that happens between couples. It's very romantic. It's very wonderful and fairy tale like, and what else? And then all of a sudden I was presented with quotes like, I believe Wilford Woodruff talking about how parents that had, or maybe it was Brigham Young, where parents that had children that left the church that were sealed to their children, I'm pretty sure it was Wilford Woodruff, would feel the tentacles of love of Christ because of the power of the sealing, pulling them back in for eternity until they one day turned to Christ and they were reunited with their family. And all of a sudden something clicked for me. To say that to your nephew for me has great significance, because the work that we do in the temple is to seal everyone, is to seal us as a human family. And that's to seal us to our heavenly parents, to the ultimate source of love. And I love these messages of love that we keep getting tonight, because that's what it's all about. It's about love. It's about the atonement. It's about Jesus Christ. And it's a very, very wonderful thing to realize. Now,
I think of it, let me say one more thing. I think of it this way. I think that the right understanding of these things must be that natural response we have, that godly part of us that loves, right? That loves our families and loves one another. That is God in us, right? Mm-hmm. That's our divine nature, yeah. Right? Okay, so the attributes of God are love. So loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. I mean, what greater price could be paid? There isn't one. Okay, and then the other attribute of God is to endow his children with agency. This is a hard thing to do as a parent. This is not easy, because when you give your children agency, they may choose to act in ways that don't love you back, right? This is the book of Moses, right? This is the weeping God of Enoch. Why are you weeping? Because my kids hate me and they hate each other. So it is the nature of God to do hard things. One, to love your children so much that you pay the ultimate price, to rescue them, to redeem them, to save them. And the other is to endow them with power for their own destiny, to choose for themselves what they want. And it's a challenge to balance those two attributes. And we are at our most godly when we do both of those things. When we love our brothers and sisters immensely, and when we give them space to exercise their agency. So, in other words, to sum up what you were saying, I believe that anybody who wants ultimately to be saved will be. Anyone who wants to be sealed will be, right? Those tentacles will reach them, and they're powerful enough to bring them back. But I don't believe that will happen to anybody against their will. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the uncertainty remains, right? People have to choose for themselves ultimately. And I think that the finished product of all that is far, far, far in the future. I don't think we're even close to knowing and seeing what people are ultimately going to become and choose.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, one of the big themes that you've been talking about is charity. And in other interviews that I've watched with you, you talk a lot about faith, hope, and charity. One of the questions that we received tonight has to do with a pretty challenging topic for, I would say, many people, a good many people, and it has to do with polygamy. This is something that Newest Saints book covered quite a bit from what I've read. It touched on it in the First Saints book as well. The question was, do you believe that polygamy in Joseph Smith's time was a commandment from God, or do you believe that this came from man? So when we think about these concepts of faith, hope, and charity, how can we apply it to this question? And what are your thoughts about this?
This is a great question and a challenging one. Let me give a one-word answer, and then let me give one that takes a few minutes and some nuance. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
So if you pushed me to a wall and said, give me a one-word answer, was the command to practice plural marriage from God or not? I would say it was, yes. Okay, but it's complicated. And I'll tell a story to illustrate. I was first asked the variation on this question, not just the plural marriage revelation, but all of Joseph Smith's revelations. I was studying the journals of William McClellan and his papers, including the story he tells about being the original scribe for D&C 66 when Joseph received it, and also having in his collection of papers several other copies of Revelations Joseph received. So I was very intensively studying Joseph's revelations and the reception history of those revelations by the earliest saints. And I was talking to my family about it a little bit, and I remember my grandmother in her mid-90s, a believer her whole life. I would have assumed there had never been a doubt in her mind about anything gospel-related. And then she said out of the blue, "Don't you think he made some of them up?" Right? What a striking question from my grandmother. And I have been thinking about that question ever since. This was a long time ago, decades ago. Been thinking about it ever since. And I've been thinking about it in the context of being as close to those revelation texts as I think probably anybody has been, right? That's what I do. I study these revelations. I study how they were received. I study the context in which they were received and what they say and how they say it, and the textual history and the variants. And so my academic conviction and my spiritual witness is that Joseph Smith was a revelator of the highest order. And if William McClellan were here, and for those who don't know his story in a nutshell, he was a convert early, 1831, and had a very difficult history with the gospel. He was in and out of it for a complicated set of reasons. I'll be happy to expound on them somewhere someday. I did last time we were together, for anybody who's interested in going back to that one. But to put it shortly, William McClellan knew that Joseph was a revelator. He asked the Lord 5 secret questions and then asked Joseph Smith to get a revelation from the Lord. And Joseph did. It was D&C 66. McClellan wrote it down as Joseph dictated it. And McClellan went on to hate Joseph Smith afterwards, not immediately, but years later. He was estranged from the church. He hated Joseph Smith. And it had a lot to do with the fact that he knew Joseph was a revelator and he could not escape it, right? The absolute knowledge that Joseph Smith had revealed the mind and will and voice of Jesus Christ in answer to McClellan's secret questions was inescapable for him. He could not get around it. Well, that's one example of many. The people who knew Joseph Smith best believed him most. Edward Partridge and Lydia moved and lived a life of poverty when they had been living a life of affluence. Why did they do it? Because Joseph Smith was a revelator. Martin Harris, the Whitmer family, right? Newell and Ann Whitney. We could go on and on. These are not stupid people. These are not dupes. These are not people who are not discerning. These are people whose lives changed dramatically because they knew Joseph was a revelator. Well, Emma is one of those people. Okay? Emma knew whether Joseph was a revelator or not. And the revelation in D&C 132 is hard sayings, right? It is, that is, for those of you who may not know, that is the revelation on plural marriage, the revelation on marriage, both monogamous and plural. So it's a conflicting one for me. I love what it says about exaltation of a monogamous marriage in the new and everlasting covenant. And I do not like what it says in the last 40 or so verses about plural marriage. Now,
Yep.
the question is not, do I like it or not? right? If that was the question, the answer is no. But the question is, do I think it was revealed by the Lord to Joseph Smith? The answer to that is yes. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that I believe the other 100 plus revelations in the book were revealed by Jesus. And I can't just single that one out because I don't like it, or I don't like 2/3 of it, right? That's a convenient thing to do, but it's a kind of presentist thing to do, in my opinion. And I think that Jesus has a record, a track history of giving bread of life discourses, like we talked about in the Gospel of John. And you can think of D&C 132 as a bread of life discourse, right? Emma, I'm going to ask you to do the thing that is the most repugnant imaginable, the most loathsome thing you can think of. And he's going to ask a bunch of other people to do that too. Notice the last verse in that revelation says, I've got more to tell you about all this, but this will suffice for now. And notice that the rationale of the revelation is Abrahamic. In other words, the example the Lord gives for why he's going to command something so radical is he goes back and says, look, I've done this before. I did this with Abraham. I did it with Sarah and Hagar, and I'm doing it again. So I teach to my students at BYU, I start teaching them this revelation by talking at some length about the God of Abraham, who we meet in the book of Abraham, the one who says, we will prove them herewith to see if they will do all things whatsoever we command them. And those who do will be added upon, and those who don't won't, right? Those who will do whatever we ask will be added upon. Now, that's repugnant to many people. They don't like it. The God of Abraham's not really asking whether we like it or not. The God of Abraham is hard to love and hard to trust, but the God of Abraham is also sometimes finds it hard to love and to trust us. And he is figuring out whether he can trust us. He will always love us, but he doesn't necessarily trust us. He's finding out if he can trust us, and we're also finding out if we can love and trust him. And the rationale for plural marriage in D&C 132 is mostly that. There are a couple of other reasons it says. One is to bear the souls of men, or what Jacob 2 refers to as raise up seed, right? That's a reason, a scriptural reason for plural marriage. The only other one is as a restitution of all things, part of the restitution of all things, which I don't understand. That one's stated, but it's not explained. There's not an explanation for why everything has to be restored and so forth. So of the reasons in the scriptures for plural marriage, the one that takes up the most amount of space and receives the greatest elaboration is, this is what the God of Abraham does. He gives Abrahamic tests. Abrahamic tests are things that that make no sense. They're repugnant. Abraham is almost offered as a human sacrifice by his father, or people, at his father's approval as a kid, to the false gods, right? And then as he comes of age and gets a promise of endless posterity, what in the world happens except the God who has rescued him from being sacrificed himself now tells him to take his son and sacrifice him. It makes no sense at all, except in the light of the God of Abraham asking us to do something that forces us to decide, what it is we believe and what if we can trust him. Right? This is somewhat similar to Nephi being told to slay Laban. He has a dilemma right then and there of almost Abrahamic proportions, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense, but let me try to sum up more efficiently. I believe the revelation is from God because I believe all of the other revelations to Joseph Smith are from God. And we could go on, I could talk for 30 minutes about each one of them, about reasons to believe that, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I just gave you the one example of William McClellan and D&C 66.
Yeah.
So I believe that I can't just single that one out just because I don't like it and because it's not, you know, I don't love the ideas that are expressed in it. Now, let me change direction a little bit and say that I do believe that Joseph Smith's revelations have his fingerprints on them, or another way to say that is in terms of communication theory. So in any communication, there's an encoder that sends the signal, and then there's a decoder that receives the signal, and between them there is noise. And that noise makes it impossible to fully understand, to decode the message or the signal perfectly. And I believe that in many of Joseph Smith's revelations, and particularly in D&C 132, there's a lot of noise. Noise between the Lord and Joseph, noise between Joseph and us. It is hard for us to decode that message. And some of the noise, I don't mean just audible noise. Okay? In fact, I really don't mean that at all. I mean cultural noise.
Mm-hmm.
Think of the patriarchy, the culture of patriarchy as noise, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is something I think we should consider seriously. So it might sound to folks like I'm trying to have it both ways, right? I'm trying to say, yeah, the revelation is divine, and at the same time, I'm not sure we have decoded it perfectly. I'm not sure Joseph decoded it perfectly. And if that's true, I am trying to have it both ways in that regard. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's okay to believe in a God that challenges us, though. Everything you're saying, I mean, it gets into some really big theological debates, like theodicy, I'm not sure how to say that word actually.
Say it loud enough and you'll always sound precocious.
Perfect, great. And like all of these things that I started to realize were a problem in my young adult life and then into my adult life. And I mean, what are we going to believe? That's the type of God that we're in. We're a type of God that is all loving and all challenging. And how do you make those things work with each other? It goes back to Joseph Smith again with proving contraries or proving things that seem to conflict.
Right.
That's when you find truth. That's when you find God. And I think the book Man's Search for Meaning by
Wazell?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I forget the author actually, but I read part of it and I remember having those same thoughts, like life is meant to be challenging. Oh, Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're looking at these incredibly challenging arguments, and that's life. That's part of the search for God. That's part of the searching for Godot. Going back to my theater days, all of these hard things that we're trying to figure out. What is God? What is Christ? What is the restored gospel? And I think the things you're saying, to me, they make sense. I understand exactly what you're saying. I understand exactly where you're going. And to kind of end our evening, I want to finish having you here and having someone who has such a wonderful wealth of knowledge on Joseph Smith and his first vision and his ministry as a prophet. What are some words that you would share for us preparing for tomorrow, which is a sacred day for Latter-day Saints, or maybe a challenging day for people who are going through faith crisis? What do you want them to know as we enter into General Conference tomorrow, a day that's going to commemorate the first vision, a day that has changed the course of my life and millions of other people? What are your thoughts?
Boy, should have something profound to say here, right? You know, maybe the best thing is that line from George Manwaring's hymn where it says Joseph sought the God of love,
Mm-hmm.
right? Joseph sought the God of love. In his time and place, it was not a given that God was loving, or at least not that loving. The most famous sermon in American history, Reverend
Sinners in a
Edwards,
hand.
Yeah.
Sinner in the hands of an angry
17:4.
God. Yeah.
Right? One of many haunting lines is, God abhors you. Well, if you're Joseph Smith and you're in your mid-teens, you're not at all confident that the Reverend Edwards was not right. You're convicted of your sins. There doesn't seem to be a darn thing you can do about it, try as you might, and you are quite worried that God abhors you. And you hope that's not true. Desperately, you hope it's not true. And you do everything you can to try to find out whether it's true or not. And the experts can't seem to help you. They have different views. It just makes it more confusing. So you find the verse that tells you you can ask God directly. You do that, and what happens? The God of love answers your prayer. He reveals himself to you. And I testify that the God of love has rescued me. And I would love if I could control his timing in coming to the aid of every single person in the sound of my voice, right? I wish I could order him around, make him do that. I'm sure I would ruin his plans, but there is a God of love, and he is the God of Joseph Smith. He is the God of the restored gospel, and Jesus Christ is his son. And the first words out of his mouth to Joseph were, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee. And that's a glorious, good message. And that's what the first vision means to me. God comes to the rescue of anxious teenagers and sinners. If they reach out to him, he will come to their aid. I'm positive that's true.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll end maybe with one last experience, kind of talking about what you mentioned, and then we'll wrap up everything. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
When I was endowed young-ish. I was endowed at 19, and I was one of the first ones not to be endowed because I was going on a mission or because I was getting married, and I was quite young. Usually they made you wait until like 25 is some sort of unwritten rule. And I remember those being the times in my life where I searched the most for God. And I thought I was young. I can't imagine being 14 and having that same kind of search. But when I was endowed, of course, we start out our endowment with the initiatory. And when I went into the initiatory and I was pronounced clean, it was an experience so sacred that was foundational to every experience that I've had since then. The temple is such an important thing for me, and it's one of the reasons why it's so interesting to me. And I would end with my testimony after getting to talk to so many amazing people. I'm in awe of the conversations I've been able to have tonight. That when I read Joseph Smith now, having had a little bit of experience in my life, when I read about him, he makes sense to me. And having had that experience as someone who felt maybe awkward or felt like I had done things wrong, and having the spiritual confirmation that God had forgiven me of my sins, that God loved me, had changed me completely from that moment to this moment now. And I hope that those of you who are struggling, that have watched this and that have stuck around till now, experience that they experience the love of God and the way that God cleans you, even if you didn't do some long repentance process, the way that God purifies you. And that's what the restoration is about for me, and I'm very grateful for it. So thank you for your thoughts, Steve. Do you have anything else you would like to end?
Just amen, sister. Thank you. God bless you in this ministry. It's really wonderful what you're doing. Thanks to you and Leo and everybody else who's put all this together.
Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your evening and enjoy General Conference. I appreciate you coming on today. Thanks.
You bet. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. And I'll say good night too. Thanks, everyone. Bye.